In 1071, upon the pitiless plains of Armenia beneath a sky that harbored no mercy, two civilizations collided in a single moment that rewrote the map of history forever. Alp Arslan was no mere sultan. He was a rare phenomenon of war, an iron frame driven by an eagle's soul, a mind that read battlefields as scholars read sacred and ancient scripture. His name in the Turkish tongue means the brave lion. No hollow compliment, but a precise description of a man who always fought at the vanguard and never governed from behind sheltering walls. When Alp Arslan rode into battle with his white turban lashed above iron armor, his soldiers read in that image one undeniable message. Their commander shared their death or their victory, without reservation. His campaigns before Manzikert were alone sufficient to forge an immortal legend. The relentless wars across Anatolia, the raids that sent Byzantine frontier garrisons into panic for years before the Great Reckoning came. Alp Arslan possessed something vanishingly rare among great commanders: the art of transforming danger into opportunity, retreat into a lethal trap, and an enemy's arrogant certainty into the very rope of his own hanging. In the Sultan's tent on the eve of battle, he sat dressed entirely in white, as though preparing for prayer rather than war, and told his men, "If I fall here today, this cloth is my shroud. Bury me where I lie." Those plain white words ignited in his soldiers a devotion no sermon could manufacture. A commander who dons his burial shroud before battle does not lead you toward defeat. He hunts victory or paradise beside you. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes bore the crushing weight of Rome's ancient legacy upon his shoulders, yet remained blind to the truth that the betrayal forming within his own ranks was deadlier than any enemy blade. Psychological warfare was Alp Arslan's first and sharpest instrument. He dispatched calm diplomatic letters to Romanos offering peace and feigning retreat, every syllable a precisely woven thread in the architecture of the Great Trap. The Seljuk Crescent was not born upon the plains of Manzikert. It was born in Alp Arslan's tent when he traced the paths of ambush in the dust with one finger, in absolute and deliberate silence. Alp Arslan did not command with the mind of a man who merely wished to win. He orchestrated the battle with the mind of one who intended to transform his victory into a preordained and unstoppable destiny. He was forged from a rare and irreplaceable alloy: the patience of the hunter, the speed of the thunderbolt, the cold composure of iron, and the wisdom of one who knows great battles are won long before the first blow falls. The Sultan's courtiers and palace counselors warned him against the recklessness of engaging a force so vastly greater in number. But Alp Arslan understood that enormous armies are often the greatest graveyards of free and decisive command. On that August morning of 1071, Alp Arslan stood and watched the horizon where Romanos arrayed his overwhelming legions. And he smiled, the slow, certain smile of a man who had already seen his victory before the battle began. Byzantium in 1071 still imagined itself the second Rome, the rightful heir to every Caesarean glory, the eternal guardian of Western civilization, and Christendom standing against the endless tide of Eastern barbarians and dust. The army of Romanos IV Diogenes was the largest force Byzantium had unleashed in centuries. 200,000 warriors, armored cavalry, Norman mercenaries, Armenian levies, and the fearsome double-axed ranks of the Varangian Guard. Yet the seemingly invincible host was in truth a coalition of the vulnerable, soldiers of divided loyalties and contradictory interests, with at its very core a faction that had already decided it wanted Romanos to fail before the first trumpet sounded. Romanos IV was a soldier emperor rather than a political creature to his marrow. a man who trusted his blade far more than his counselor's wit, and against a mind like Alp Arslan's, that instinct was his first and most mortal flaw. Byzantine arrogance, accumulated across centuries of civilizational supremacy, had transformed from a virtue into a curse. The emperor dismissed the Seljuks entirely, regarding them as nomadic tribes drifted in from the peripheral and inconsequential dust. The true and most lethal instrument in the equation of catastrophe was Andronikos Doukas, a Byzantine commander from the rival dynasty, carrying in his chest an imperial hatred that outweighed an entire army's worth of open and declared enemies. Andronikos understood with cold precision that a Romanos victory meant the solidification of his rival's throne and the permanent exile of the Doukas bloodline from every corridor of imperial power and sovereign influence. The Byzantine host of 200,000 marched toward Manzikert in a formation whose scale blinded the eye, arrogance preceding every footfall, as though victory had already been engraved upon the field by divine and unalterable decree. Alp Arslan led but 50,000, less than a quarter of Romanos' force, yet knew with absolute certainty that buried within the Byzantine chest was a bleeding wound named treachery, and that wound would equalize everything on the field. 50,000 against 200,000. To the uninitiated observer, this was no battle. It was organized suicide, the pure arithmetic of annihilation. That remained every calculation made by those who did not know the Seljuk doctrine or the name of what festered behind the Byzantine curtain. Romanos dispatched his forward scouts to locate the Seljuk positions, and those units returned shattered and scattered, not from overwhelming numbers, but because the Seljuks appeared and vanished like desert wind, obeying no logic any Byzantine commander could decipher. That deliberate and calculated appearing and vanishing was the first link in the Great Trap's chain. Corrupt the enemy's intelligence picture. Force him to march in blindness, while your own commander watches everything with the cold precision of the hunting falcon. Romanos felt the fatal comfort of the deceived when he watched the Seljuks retreating before him like a routed and broken force, and ordered the full advance toward Manzikert, unknowing that he was walking willingly into the belly of the Great Trap. On the opposing ground, Alp Arslan observed the Byzantine advance with the unhurried, merciless patience of the master hunter, neither rushing nor slowing, managing time the way a bowman manages the tension of his string before the killing arrow is loosed. The deliberate withdrawal was among the most sacred Seljuk tactical commandments. Convince the enemy he is hunting you until his formation overextends and his order dissolves. Then turn upon him at the precisely pre-calculated moment of maximum vulnerability. Romanos sent his right commander to the right flank, his left commander to the left, and stood himself at the center, a textbook formation, while Alp Arslan surrounded it as wildfire surrounds seasoned tinder, hungrily, completely, and without mercy. What Romanos did not know was that his center was already rotting from within, commanded by a man of every wrong allegiance, Andronikos Doukas. The concealed blade pressed silently and patiently against the spine of Byzantium's greatest and most celebrated army. Andronikos required no explicit or declarable act of treason, for intelligent treachery has never required open words, a loosened pace at the moment of advance, a delayed flank reinforcement, a justified withdrawal at the single most devastating and irreversible moment possible. The 200,000 of the Byzantine host represented a force of staggering theoretical potential. Yet their true fighting strength was far smaller once the mercenaries who fought for coin rather than conviction were subtracted from any honest calculation of real power. So the two armies arrayed themselves on the morning of the 26th of August, 1071, 50,000 who knew precisely what they intended, and 200,000 who did not yet know they were marching toward their own catastrophic annihilation. The Battle of Manzikert began in the late afternoon, contrary to every prevailing military convention of the age, and that chosen timing was no accident or careless oversight, but Alp Arslan's first and most deliberate strategic stroke. The Byzantine army advanced with the unshakable confidence of men harboring no doubt about their victory, while he shackled them beneath their heavy iron armor, and Seljuk arrows rained upon their vanguard like a storm that refused to cease. The Seljuk horsemen loosed their arrows and withdrew, loosed and withdrew, loosed and withdrew, a dance of death in which every movement had been memorized and refined to the precision of a perfectly wound and calibrated instrument of war. The Byzantines, burdened beneath their armored weight, advanced in pursuit of the retreating Seljuks, advancing, each step widening the abyss of destruction that silently gathered and tightened like a noose around the advancing and arrogant Byzantine host. When the Byzantine army reached precisely the position Alp Arslan had chosen for them, the arrows ceased and a sudden crushing silence fell across the entire plain. And that silence was not the battle's end, but the catastrophe's true and terrible beginning. In that exact moment, Alp Arslan released his command with a single silent gesture. The two Seljuk wings that had been withdrawing throughout the entire engagement reversed instantaneously, snapping shut like the wings of an eagle closing upon blind and completely unsuspecting prey. The Seljuk Crescent transformed in seconds from a retreating defensive arc into a completed circle of death, closing upon the stunned Byzantine mass from every direction simultaneously, with the terrible and irresistible precision of a perfectly assembled iron trap. Romanos understood in that shattering moment that he had never been chasing the Seljuks. The Seljuks had been leading him like a bull on a rope toward the slaughterhouse, and he had walked there willingly, cloaked in all his arrogance and certainty. Chaos ignited throughout the Byzantine ranks. The right wing struck from behind, the left flank hit from the side, and the center dissolved beneath arrows arriving ceaselessly from every compass point, with no pause, no mercy, and no end in sight. And in that precise moment when Romanos needed every sword he commanded, Andronikos Doukas executed the betrayal he had been preparing in patient silence, ordering his entire wing to perform a full and complete withdrawal from the field of battle. It was no measured or defensible military withdrawal. It was a dagger pressed slowly and deliberately into the spine, an entire force turning its back and fleeing at the peak of engagement, leaving Romanos and his center naked before the advancing Seljuk tide. The treachery of Doukas was brilliant in its cold and architectural precision. Not a single arrow fired in its service, not a single soldier killed by its hand, yet it transformed the theoretical victory of 200,000 into catastrophic defeat before half their number. Emperor Romanos found himself suddenly fighting without wings, like a great bird stripped of its feathers at the very apex of its flight. His flanks naked, his sides encircled, his mind and spirit shattered by the crushing and impossible weight of betrayal. Romanos ordered a withdrawal to regroup, but withdrawal under a sounding Seljuk fire transformed instantly into total dissolution. Soldiers fleeing without leadership, formations collapsing like towers of ancient dust before a wave that arrived without warning or pity. At the height of the battle's most savage conflagration, Alp Arslan oversaw the field from an elevated position, directing the movements of his wings like a grandmaster moving the pieces of a chess game, arranged with perfect and deliberate premeditation. The Seljuk light cavalry was his absolute and decisive advantage. They struck and dissolved, returned and struck again, igniting panic and reforming in seconds, as though every man had been born and forged solely and exclusively for this lethal and singular art. The wounded emperor, in the midst of the chaos and cascading defeat, attempted to rally whoever remained of his shattered and leaderless army, while Seljuk arrows harvested rank after rank with a cold persistence that allowed no rest, no pause, no mercy. The Seljuk pursuit proved the most catastrophic phase of the Byzantine disaster. The broken host fled and the horsemen hunted from behind, every desperate step of flight increasing the distance between the fugitive and any surviving whisper of hope or salvation. Flight before the light Seljuk horseman was more lethal than standing firm. The man in retreat becomes the clearest target, loses the protective shield of his companions, and leaves his back entirely open to a retribution that recognizes no boundary and no restraint. What unfolded upon Manzikert's field in those hours was no longer battle. It was an organized and methodical slaughter, an army without a head, trampled beneath the hooves of Seljuk cavalry, drawing the iron noose ever tighter and more inexorable with every relentless charge. Romanos attempted to establish a defensive position, but his forces dissolved around him like the walls of an ancient fortress shaken to its foundations by an earthquake, the Seljuks tightening their circle until the emperor found himself in near complete isolation and abandonment. Romanos fought with a courage that cannot and must not be denied, wounded in hand and back, his horse slain beneath him. He continued fighting on foot until the accumulation of wounds and the completeness of his encirclement removed every remaining possibility of escape. When Alp Arslan was informed that the Byzantine Emperor had been taken captive, the Sultan fell into a long and deliberate silence, his gaze fixed upon the distant horizon, then spoke in a voice quiet as iron striking iron, "Bring him before me." What followed was among the most extraordinary and disorienting tableau in all of human history. The emperor of the greatest power in the Western world was brought bound as a prisoner before the very Sultan Byzantium had long dismissed as a barbarian from the dust. Alp Arslan placed his foot upon the neck of Romanos in a symbolic gesture that shattered the civilizational scales permanently and irrevocably, then asked in a measured voice, "What would you have done with me had you been the conqueror and I your captive?" Romanos answered with the bitter lucidity of a man who had drained defeat to its very last drop. "I would have killed you or made you an eternal spectacle to warn all who dared challenge Rome." Alp Arslan smiled slowly. "Then your punishment is far harder than that." The Sultan continued, "Your punishment is that I shall treat you in the precise inverse. I shall pardon you, ransom you, and return you to your throne in exchange for gold and a covenant of peace." And that pardon was the deepest humiliation any dungeon could have offered. The pardoning of the defeated emperor was a declaration addressed directly to the judgment of history itself. "We are not the barbarians you have named us, but a civilization that defeats you and then forgives you, and that is the highest summit of victory." Romanos returned to Constantinople shattered, not merely by his wounds, but by the unbearable gravity of the greater indignity, the victor's forgiveness, which presses upon the shoulders of kings more crushingly than 1,000 chains and 1,000 irons combined. But Romanos was not permitted to enjoy his gifted freedom for long. His enemies from the Doukas house deposed him immediately upon his return, gouged out his eyes, and cast him into imprisonment until he died in the dark and the forgotten. The internal betrayal did not confine itself to the field of Manzikert. It extended its shadow to kill Romanos twice, once on the battlefield when his armies were stripped from around him, and once again inside the poisoned corridors of the imperial palace. Manzikert's field on that day bore witness to more than one military engagement. There was the war between Seljuk and Byzantine, the war between Romanos and Doukas, and looming above them all, the war for the survival and soul of two entire civilizations. The Seljuk Crescent that Alp Arslan executed at Manzikert was no transient battlefield maneuver. It was a strategic jewel that armies and military academies would study, dissect, and attempt to replicate for centuries upon centuries that followed without end. What Alp Arslan accomplished with 50,000 against 200,000 teaches not only military doctrine, but a timeless philosophical truth. Quality of command and unity of purpose precede the raw weight of numbers, always and without exception. The 50,000, wrapped in absolute certainty and singular command, conquered the army 4 times their size, because the greater host carried treachery in its chest where loyalty should have been permanently lodged, and that treachery decided everything before the first sword was raised. When Romanos fell captive into Alp Arslan's hands, it was not the emperor alone who fell. The great illusion fell with him. The illusion that Byzantium was unconquerable, its legendary walls impenetrable, its ancient legions unbreakable and eternal. Manzikert was not the death of Byzantium. It was the wound that would never close or heal. In its aftermath, all of Anatolia opened before the advancing Seljuk and Turkoman tribes like a flood, whose tide no remaining wall or army could restrain. Anatolia, the very heart of the Byzantine Empire, its most fertile and populous province, transformed within less than a century from deep and ancient Christian Byzantine soil into Islamic Seljuk land, from which it would never in any age return. That colossal geopolitical loss drove the kings of Europe and the princes of the Church into genuine existential terror, igniting the fires of the Crusades that would drown the entire region in rivers of blood for 2 relentless and catastrophic centuries. Manzikert is therefore not merely the record of an Islamic military triumph. It is the single spark that illuminated every event of the 3 centuries that followed across both the Middle East and Europe simultaneously, without exception and without pause. The Seljuk Empire, established by Alp Arslan and his successors across Anatolian soil, would become the very ground in which the seeds of the great Ottoman state germinated, the empire destined in its own appointed time to consume all of Byzantium utterly. Alp Arslan did not know on that night of supreme triumph that he had planted seeds of an empire that would endure 6 centuries and reshape the face of both the Islamic and European worlds into something that could never be undone or reversed. The tactical inheritance of Manzikert remained alive and breathing within the great texts of military strategy, the deliberate withdrawal designed to lure and overextend, the closing crescent, and the devastating flanking ambush, a doctrine that proved itself unconquerable across every age. Napoleon Bonaparte, who consumed the history of great battles with a strategist's insatiable and systematic hunger, is reported to have drawn from the encircling withdrawal and deliberate feint lessons that he applied directly in his defining European campaigns and conquests. Even in the age of modern warfare, when a staff officer wishes to teach the doctrine of the feigned retreat or the enveloping ambush, no model exists that is purer, richer in instruction, or more architecturally perfect than what was enacted upon the plains of Manzikert. The internal betrayal embodied by Doukas became a classical case study in strategic catastrophe, demonstrating with brutal clarity how dissolution from within destroys an army long before the external enemy has the opportunity to deliver its final and conclusive blow. Every war college that teaches Manzikert presents it as a master class in the psychology of war and the anatomy of command failure, how betrayal from within is 1,000 times more lethal than any army advancing from without, regardless of its size or armament. Byzantium, after Manzikert, entered a relentless cycle of internal conflict, dynastic bloodletting, and grinding resource exhaustion, each decade offering a brief and deceptive calm before accelerating the empire's inevitable and irreversible march toward final eclipse and dust. 4 centuries separated Manzikert from the fall of Constantinople in 1453, but the first stone in the architecture of that terminal collapse was laid with absolute certainty upon the ancient and blood-stained plains of Manzikert on a single August afternoon. The empire that had once commanded the greatest fleets and extended its borders east to distant horizons slept in full confidence before Manzikert, and woke afterward to a world so permanently and fundamentally altered that it could never again find the footing it had lost. Alp Arslan himself did not long survive his greatest hour of triumph. He was slain less than 2 years later by one of his own captive prisoners, proving that the destiny which creates heroes never exempts even the greatest of them from their appointed and inevitable portion. Yet his legacy continued walking through the long corridors of history with steady and unbroken strides. The opening of Anatolia to Islam, the entrenchment of Seljuk dominion, and the planting of a seed of power that would grow Ottoman and alter the political geography of the earth. In the annual commemoration of Manzikert, modern Turkey celebrates that battle as the founding act of the Turkish Anatolian identity, fully understanding that its very existence upon that ancient and storied soil was born on that decisive and irreversible August day. Manzikert is not merely the memory of an Islamic military triumph, it is an eternal lesson written in iron and dust, that sheer numbers alone never forge lasting victory, and that internal cohesion tilts the scales of battle long before the first sword clears its scabbard. And you, now surveying the map of the world and seeing Turkey standing where Byzantium once ruled, must understand that all of it, every border redrawn, every dynasty built, every century of consequence that followed, began that August morning in 1071 when Alp Arslan smiled.